Whether you wear a badge or not, if you care about courage, clarity, discipline, and the price of decisions in the moment that define lives, you've come to the right place. This is where training meets consequence, where the law collides with human behavior, and the fog of uncertainty tests the limits of reason. These are the stories of pressure, of purpose, and what it means to hold the line when the world loses balance. I'm Don, a police officer, instructor, and founder of Forecast Securities Group, and I'll be your guide through the storm. Welcome to the Conditions Report.
Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome back. It's 2026, which means that I felt like this is a good starting point to make a nice, clean break and start season 2 of the Conditions Report. The previous season was short, only 12 episodes, filming roughly about one a week. So we're going to continue with that pace, hopefully. So the next season should be roughly 52. And I figure the beginning of each year is a nice, clean way to reevaluate the show every single year. That being said, the structure is very similar, but it is a little different. I'm a big fan of being a student of life and constantly learning. I preach that on the show, and I'm preaching that here. So as a result, I've done some review of the data from the show, the analytics from YouTube and Spotify, and made some adjustments accordingly. And hopefully it makes the show a little bit better. With that being said, a new year, a new me, new show. So let's get into it. I'm Don, and this is the Conditions Report. If you've been listening to the show, you know the premise. If you're new here, here's what you need to know. The Conditions Report is the weather forecast for street cops, detectives, and admin. It's what's coming and what's changing in the environment we work in. But before we go any further, a quick disclaimer. I'm not an attorney, and nothing discussed on the show is legal advice. I'm not speaking on behalf of any government agency or law enforcement agency, and the views expressed here are those of Forecast Securities Group, my training and consulting company. They are also an exercise in the protected American free speech. If you need legal advice or guidance specific to your agency or jurisdiction, you should consult a qualified attorney. This podcast is for educational and informational purposes only. We're definitely not here to judge officers involved in incidences or to second guess the decisions they make with the benefit of hindsight. The point is to learn from the hard-earned lessons that they fought for on our behalf and improve as a team. So let's move into the episode summary. In this episode, we're going to talk about Barnes v. Felix. It's less about the case itself and more about the environment surrounding the case. It's about how police encounters can be judged after they're over and how decisions made in seconds are later evaluated over months or years, and how the rules that govern those evaluations are shifting, often quietly, often incrementally, and without much warning to the people who will feel the consequences the most. And because this is season 2, the environment changes, and so does the show. In this episode, we're also going to carefully walk through what they said in Barnes v. Felix. We'll spend time with the facts in the case, the court's own language, and the doctrinal framework the Supreme Court corrected. We're going to talk about pre-incident conduct, not as like a moral judgment, but more as a structured reality. We talk about how the courts understand the totality of circumstances standard, why narrowing that inquiry to a single instant was a constitutional error, and why restoring temporal context matters. We'll expand the conversation beyond deadly force cases, and we'll talk about patrol decisions, investigative sequences, supervision, and administration. We'll talk about how choices that can feel routine or unremarkable at the time can later become central to civil litigation, administrative review, and professional accountability. And as we work through all of that, we're going to also introduce a new standing segment for season 2. It's called the Leadership Navigational Aid. So much like in maritime navigation, we use buoys or other aids to help guide our route. This is a moral navigational aid. And for those of you who find yourselves leading both formally and informally, these are short maxims meant to help you lead with humility, perspective, and purpose. Finally, we'll step back and take a look at what Barnes signals about where things are headed, not just legally, but institutionally, what kind of professional environment is forming, and what officers and supervisors and administrators should be thinking about now before the conditions fully settle in. All right, so here's your situation brief. On the afternoon of April 28, 2016, Officer Roberto Felix Jr. was patrolling a highway outside of Houston when he received a radio alert regarding a vehicle with outstanding toll violations. Felix locates this vehicle, a Toyota Corolla, and initiates a traffic stop. The driver, Barnes, pulls to the shoulder. Felix approaches the driver's side door and asks for the driver's license and proof of insurance. Barnes stated that he did not have his license with him and that the vehicle was a rental in his girlfriend's name. As he spoke, Barnes began rummaging through papers inside the vehicle, and Felix instructed him several times to stop digging around. Felix stated that he smelled marijuana and asked Barnes whether there was anything in the car that he should know about. Barnes responded that he might have identification in the trunk. Felix instructed Barnes to open the trunk from the inside of the vehicle. Barnes did so and turned off the ignition. All of this occurred quickly in less than 2 minutes. Then the tempo changes. With his right hand resting on his holster, Felix instructs Barnes to exit the vehicle. Barnes opens the door but does not exit. Instead, he restarts the car. As the vehicle begins to move forward, Felix unholstered his firearm and stepped onto the door seal. With his head above the roofline and without any visibility into the vehicle's interior, Felix fired 2 shots while shouting commands. Barnes was struck but managed to stop the vehicle. Felix radios for backup, but by the time assistance arrives, Barnes was deceased. From the moment the vehicle began moving to the moment it stopped was approximately 5 seconds. Roughly 2 seconds passed between Felix stepping onto the door seal and the first shot being fired. And those seconds became the focal point of the legal analysis that would follow. Current conditions. The lower court analyzed this case using what is commonly referred to as the moment of force or moment of threat framework. Under that approach, the constitutional inquiry narrows to a single question: whether the officer was facing an immediate threat at the precise moment deadly force was used. And that framework exists for a reason. It reflects the reality that officers have to make decisions under stress, uncertainty, and severe time pressure. It exists to prevent hindsight from distortion, splitting split-second judgment into something that never was there. And the Supreme Court did not reject that reality. What it rejected was the idea that the Fourth Amendment reasonableness analysis can be frozen at a single instant in time. In its opinion, the court explained that the totality of circumstance inquiry has no temporal cutoff. Courts are required to consider relevant events that occurred before the use of force, not because those events automatically render force unreasonable, but because they provide necessary context for evaluating the moment force is used. The court stated that courts, quote unquote, cannot narrow the totality of circumstance inquiry to focus only on a single moment, unquote. It emphasizes that reasonableness requires looking at what came before, where those earlier events bear on the encounter as a whole. Importantly, the court was explicit about what it was not deciding. It did not determine whether Felix acted reasonably. It did not decide whether Felix's actions created the danger that followed. It declined to resolve those issues altogether. And the reason matters. Because the lower court never even addressed whether earlier actions by the officer were relevant, because their analysis was so tightly time-bound by focusing on exclusively the final second that they excluded from view any actions that may have shaped the conditions requiring deadly force. And the court pointed to a specific example. The lower court never considered the relevance, if any, of Felix stepping onto the door seal of a moving vehicle, not because that action was necessarily unreasonable, not because it was necessarily decisive, but because their chosen time frame prevented the question from being asked altogether. And the narrowing was the constitutional error in the first place. The Supreme Court vacated the Fifth Circuit's judgment and remanded the case, instructing the lower court to reassess reasonableness using a longer timeline. And though the holding was narrow, the implications were not. The moment of force still matters. It simply no longer stands alone by itself. And the decision sits along Graham v. Connor. Graham governs how force is judged in the moment. Barnes reminds us that moments are shaped long before they arrive. It also sits in the very shadow of Los Angeles v. Mendez, where the court rejected the Ninth Circuit's provocation rule, while still affirming that pre-incident conduct may be relevant to Fourth Amendment analysis under the totality of circumstances. Taken together, these cases do not impose liability for earlier decisions by default. They restore the ability to see the full weather pattern instead of only the lightning strikes. That brings us to today's leadership navigational aid. For those of you who find yourselves leading formally or informally, these are short maxims meant to help you lead with humility, perspective, and purpose as conditions change. The maxim for this episode comes from Benjamin Franklin, writing in a letter in the winter of 1734, moving into 1735, at a time when fires would routinely erase entire neighborhoods. He begins by explaining why he's writing in the first place. Quote, being old and lame of my hands, and thereby incapable of assisting my fellow citizens, when their houses are on fire, I must beg them to take in good part the following hints on the subject of fires. He states plainly that he can't help anyone once the crisis is fully underway. What he can do is offer foresight, and he writes a line that survives centuries and most people will recognize. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. But he refuses to let that remain abstract. He writes on, care how they suffer living, brand's end, or coals in a full shovel to be carried out of one room into another, up or down stairs, unless in a warming pan, shut. For scraps of fire may fall into the chinks and make no appearance till midnight, when your stairs begin in flames. You may be forced, as I once was, to leap out of your window and hazard your necks to avoid being over-roasted. He writes of shallow hearths of wooden moldings, hearts of pine and full of turpentine placed close enough to flame that ignition is inevitable. And he sharpens his point, saying, I have known foul chimneys burn most furiously a few days after they were swept, people in confidence that they are clean, making a large fire. Everybody among us is allowed to sweep chimneys. That please to undertake that business, and if chimney fires through fault of the sweeper, the owner pays the fine, and the sweeper goes free. This thing is not right. Those who undertake sweeping of chimneys and employ servants for that purpose ought to be licensed by the mayor, and if the chimney fire and flames out in 15 days after sweeping, the fine should be paid by the sweeper, for it is his fault. Franklin is not describing laziness. He's describing misplaced trust at a time when anyone could claim to be a chimney sweep. There were no standards, no licensing, and no training, and chimneys burned, the homeowner bore the cost, while the person who claimed expertise walked away. His solution was not caution alone. It was professionalization, training, standards, and accountability. Crews who practiced before emergencies reviewed failures and successes together and built competence through preparation rather than heroics. He writes on, saying, I believe I cannot do better than to offer for imitation the example of a city in a neighboring province. There, as I am well informed, a club or society of active men belonging to fire engines, whose business is to attend to all fires whenever they are happening, and to work it once a quarter, and see it kept in order. Some of these are to handle the fire hooks, and others the axes, which are always kept with the engine. He's referring to fire companies, and specifically to the Boston Fire Society, established in 1717, and later would be the model for his own Franklin's Union Fire Company in 1736. Read alongside Barnes v. Felix, the structure's the same. Graham governs the final seconds. Barnes reminds us that those seconds are shaped long before they arrive. Everything that happens before an encounter matters. The study of case law, repetition into training, combatives work that teaches distance, balance, and control under stress, scenarios training that builds judgment before adrenaline narrows perception, planning and de-escalation, positioning, tempo, and threat assessment practiced while there's still room to think. By the time an encounter collapses into the seconds that matter, leadership influence has already done most of the work. Distance and tempo have been set. Positioning has been chosen. Training has either been there or it hasn't. And Franklin understood that once the fire is fully alive, courage is no substitution for preparation. Barnes carries that same truth in the modern professional environment. Looking ahead, Barnes v. Felix should be understood as a signal rather than an endpoint. The court didn't create a new test, and it didn't rewrite Graham. It did not resurrect the provocation theory. What it did was restore constitutional viability to the full sequence of events that led up to the force, without collapsing doctrine or imposing automatic liability. Courts are increasingly resistant to snapshot analysis. Investigations now reconstruct timelines in detail. Litigation examines sequencing, pacing, and decision making well before the moment of force is used. And administrative reviews are no longer confined to the final use of force report, but increasingly focus on pre incident decisions, supervision, and training. This does not mean officers are expected to control all outcomes. It does mean that how urgency is created, managed, or avoided is becoming central to how incidences are being evaluated. Decisions about tempo now matter more, whether the encounter was allowed to slow or whether distance could have been created, whether positioning increased or reduced risk, whether escalation matched the severity of the suspect's offense, and the presence or absence of true exigency. Those are no longer treated as background details. They're becoming part of the core analysis, and severity of the crime matters. Exigency matters. Where the situations actually require speed, compression, and immediate control, or whether the time was available but not used, is increasingly relevant to the facts. And the reality places responsibility upstream. Departments cannot rely solely on policy language written for a final moment, and officers cannot only rely on performance in the last seconds. Administrators cannot assume that outcomes alone will carry analysis. Preparation now matters more. Training that addresses distance, tempo, positioning, and decision making under stress matter. Combatives training that teaches balance, control, and spatial awareness matter. Scenario based training that forces officers to manage uncertainty before adrenaline narrows perception matter. And supervision that reinforces thoughtful pacing rather than reflective urgency matter. So does mission planning. Departments, officers, and administrators must prepare ahead of time for how encounters evolve, not just how they end. Policy, training, and supervision must account for how urgency is assessed and how threats are interpreted, and how early decisions shape the conditions officers are later forced to operate within. The professional environment is becoming less tolerant of narrow timelines and more attentive to how situations are constructed, less focused on lightning strike and more focused on the weather system that produced it. This is the forecast. As we close, let's remember the point of the show isn't to pass judgment or to revisit decisions with the benefit of hindsight. It's to learn as a team, to improve, and we're all leaders. Keep the LNA in the back of your mind. The work is complicated, the environment is demanding, and none of us get it perfect. Stay hungry, stay humble. I'm Don, and this has been the Conditions Report. Be the calm in the storm, the clarity in confusion, and always influence the weather.